Okay, welcome back, everyone. I've been gone for some time, so I apologize for that. And I need to get back to resistance to tyranny. Now, are you kidding me? Where did I leave off? Chapter 2. Good lord. Let me see. I should have figured this out, but I thought I read more than one chapter. That
is when a citizen reaches the point where resistance to war between nations. It is impossible to prescribe a proper authority to call for a revolt. Only the people who retain the right to govern themselves can undertake revolt when the proper conditions are met. Neither the just war criteria as outlined above, nor the more specific criteria we have meetings every currency. The people who retain the right to govern themselves can undertake revolt when the proper conditions are met. Neither the just war criteria as outlined above, nor the more specific criteria given in the Catechism can be applied mechanically. The criteria represent guidelines, not measuring rods. Prudence and judgment are still required to determine whether the proper conditions are met in a specific instance. Moreover, the just war criteria.
Okay, yeah. So we're on chapter 2. Alright. Got a long way to go, people. Guess that's why I need to stay at it and do a chapter each time and just keep trucking. Chapter 2 is the probability of success. Even if moral, is armed resistance futile? Is it impossible for an armed citizenry to overthrow an oppressive government? History shows that it is possible, but not always successful. In this chapter, we will examine some successes and some failures to identify some of the problems and possibilities. Current historical trends have both favorable and unfavorable factors affecting armed resistance. A successful resistance movement will necessarily take as much advantage of the favorable factors as possible while minimizing the effects of the unfavorable factors. One of the effects of the invention of gunpowder was to strengthen central governments against local governments and ordinary citizens. Cannon could knock down castle walls, and the king could afford more and bigger cannon than could the barons. Castles were replaced by far more expensive forts, and armies became professionalized. The result was to strengthen central governments in their struggles with local leaders and rebellious citizenry. In the 19th century, however, two inventions started a train of events that has led to a shift in the balance between central governments and dissident groups. The first of these was the metallic cartridge. The second was smokeless powder. Prior to the invention of the metallic cartridge, which incorporated primer, powder charge, and projectile in a single unit, loading a gun was a complicated operation. The gunner had to pour a measured charge of powder down the barrel, ram a bullet down on top of the powder, then arrange for a cap or a flint to ignite the powder. Most firearms were smoothbore muskets because it was too difficult to ram a lead ball down a rifled barrel. The slow rate of fire of the individual firearm in combination with the low accuracy from the smoothbore meant that mass troops were necessary to fight a battle. A body of well-drilled troops, trained to hold their ground and fire in massed volleys, could defeat any undisciplined body of rebels in a fight on open ground. The metallic cartridge changed part of that. It made the repeating rifle possible. Bolt action and lever action firearms could be operated rapidly by relatively untrained troops. Thus, the rate of fire of the individual fighter was determined by the firearm itself, not by the skills of the gunner. Ultimately, this led to the semi-automatic rifle, which reloaded itself after each shot, and the machine gun, which fired continuously so long as the trigger was pulled. However, black powder still presented a problem. It fouled the barrel quickly. After a few shots, the firearm became inaccurate. The invention of smokeless powder changed that. Hundreds of rounds could be fired before leading or other metallic fouling in the barrel caused accuracy to deteriorate. Another virtue of smokeless powder was literally the absence of smoke. Each time a black powder weapon is fired, a thick cloud of smoke reveals the shooter's position. Smokeless powder made concealed firing possible. Sniping and ambushing became much more feasible. The ability to fire from concealment further shifted the balance away from regular troops and toward rebels. With the 20th century came many more weapons that further strengthened rebels and dissidents. The trench mortar, which gave small units the equivalent of short-range artillery. The recoilless rifle, which provided even more firepower to small units. The bazooka, the Panzerfaust, the rocket-propelled grenade, and similar weapons, which gave the individual the ability to defeat tanks and low-flying helicopters. The Red Eye, the SA-7, and the Stinger, which gave the individual some protection against aircraft. These 20th century weapons are all the products of industry. Rebels, depending upon them, need a source of supply, usually external to the country in which they are fighting. However, with such a source of supply, a substantial resistance operation can be conducted. Without such a source of supply, a resistance force is limited to rifles and pistols. However, ammunition for these is comparatively simple to manufacture, provided the consumables, primers, powder, and bullets, can be obtained. The expended cartridge cases must be recovered so they can be reloaded, but this can be accomplished if resistance forces are not driven off the battlefield before they can salvage the brass. In short, then, while the development of gunpowder initially had the effect of strengthening central governments against their citizens, more recent developments have shifted the balance back toward the citizens. In the remainder of this chapter, we will briefly look at several resistance movements and their success or failure. Successful resistance movements. Recent history has seen several successful resistance movements. A few will be described briefly here with the intent of bringing out some lessons. The American War for Independence. The American War for Independence did not come about overnight. The first battles, Lexington and Concord, were the flashpoints for a struggle that had been building for almost a generation. Taxes and commerce restrictions were the major sore points. Americans were British citizens. They demanded the same rights they would have had in England, particularly the right to have their own legislators levy taxes. In addition, they demanded the right to trade with other nations besides England. The actual trigger for the War of Independence was the British attempt to prevent war by disarming the Americans. After first confiscating all the privately held guns in Boston and confiscating all the gunpowder stored in Boston's powder houses, the British attempted to seize guns, cannon, and powder in the rural areas around Boston. The troops sent to do this met with initial success, easily defeating the militia forces they encountered. However, the British attempt to make an orderly withdrawal to Boston turned into a disaster as they had to fight almost every foot of the way. The Americans then laid siege to Boston. They fortified breeds and Bunker Hills. The British, rather than make an amphibious landing behind the fortifications, instead made a series of frontal attacks. Each attack was beaten off until the Americans ran out of ammunition. From one standpoint, the battle was a victory for the British. They ultimately took and held the ground. However, from another standpoint, it was a defeat for the British. American casualties were about 150 dead and 300 wounded out of 1,500 in the battle. For a casualty rate of 30%, British casualties were 1,150 with 250 killed, out of a total force of 2,500 men, or nearly 50% casualties. Stokesbury writes, in all 7 years of actual fighting and 20 more or less major battles, 1/8 of British officer deaths and 1/6 of wounds were sustained at Bunker Hill. There were valid grounds for arguing that the British Army, and especially Sir William Howe, commander of British forces, did not recover from that gory afternoon. Totting up the strengths and weaknesses of the British and Americans would lead one to assume the British could have everything their way. They had a navy that eventually blockaded all American ports. They had what was possibly the best army in the world, with plenty of experience in combat and competent leaders. They had the resources of an empire behind them. The Americans, by contrast, had little or no military background. Although most were familiar with firearms, the resistance forces were perennially short of food, clothing, medical supplies, and ammunition, and sometimes went months without pay. Enlistments were for a short time, often 3 months, which required General Washington to plan his battles around the terms of enlistment of his troops, who tended to disappear when their enlistments were up. Public opinion in America was at first badly split over the war. In the South, there were even loyalist militias opposed to independence. Moreover, because of the number of loyalists among the population, the British were always well informed of the dispositions of the American forces. However, the British had many problems as well. They had an empire to run, and the war in America was, to a certain extent, a distraction. British merchants did a great deal of business with the colonies, and the war hurt their businesses. The British government itself was divided, with some officials determined to bring the colonies to heel, but others willing to compromise in some way. Thus, the British war effort was not as vigorous as it might have been. One factor leading to the American victory was that the Patriot forces seized control of governmental bodies, local, colonial, and eventually national. In effect, they had a government in being. They thus became clothed with some degree of legitimacy, which the Loyalists lacked. A second important factor was the colonial shipping industry, which quickly turned to privateering, seizing British merchant ships at sea. This provided the American forces with cash and military supplies, as well as correspondence between the British government and its officials in America. This shipping industry also was important in importing military supplies. Particularly, Dutch supplied gunpowder. A third important factor was the support of the French, clandestine at first, but later with ships and troops. France became an important source of supply for the guns and uniforms. Converting British subjects in America to American patriots was a necessary part of the American war effort. Some British miscues, such as hiring Hessian mercenaries, helped the American cause. However, an important part of this process was pro-American propaganda. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense sold 500,000 copies. The thrust of it was that the problem was the British government. Americans needed to throw it off and form their own government. The Declaration of Independence, essentially a legal brief for the American colonies, was finally published after more than a year of fighting. Paine's later pamphlet, The Crisis, These Are the Times That Try Men's Souls, rallied the flagging spirits of the Americans to continue the struggle. It was crucial to the American cause to obtain allies in Europe. While most of the nations of Europe disliked the British, they could not afford to appear allied to the Americans while the success of the war was in doubt. Eventually, France was the only European power willing to provide major support. The Dutch did allow use of their possessions in the Caribbean as bases for privateers and for supplies. French support turned out to be a major factor in the ultimate success of the American cause. A serious mistake the American forces made was conducting raids against settlements near Halifax, Nova Scotia, turning potential allies into loyalists and losing the territory for the future United States. It cannot be said too often that resistance forces must not antagonize the people they claim they are trying to free from tyranny. And that goes back to chapter 1. The British made a similar mistake in using their Indian allies to attack the colonies from the west. Scalping of women and burning of farms and towns was not the way to regain the loyalty of the Americans. To many Americans, the Indians were worse than the Hessians. Ultimately, the single thing that made the American victory possible was that, despite everything, the American army didn't disintegrate. This was in no small measure due to the efforts of George Washington. Nevertheless, there were several deployments during the course of the war. First, untrained militia learned to stand and fight. After that, officers learned to maneuver their forces effectively. Finally, the generals learned how to be generals, and those who couldn't learn were shoved aside. Almost any resistance movement will likely have to go through a similar process. Keeping the force in the field, learning while bleeding, will be difficult but necessary. Once it was clear that the American forces could win battles, European powers, especially France, were willing to take sides openly. Working with allies is not the easiest thing to do, and there were many misunderstandings between the Americans and the French, despite the fact the French were actually more interested in possessions in the Caribbean than in helping the Americans. Ultimately, the war was decided by the Battle of Yorktown. British General Cornwallis was bottled up there, with the French fleet holding the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and both French and American troops besieging the British. Even after the victory at Yorktown, it took 2 more years for a peace treaty to be signed. Those were 2 years of raids and counter-raids, while General Washington struggled to keep his army together. But with the final peace treaty, America became a nation. The Communist Revolution in China. The Communist victory in China came at the end of a set of very complex events. Exploitation of China by European countries during the 19th century, the 1911 revolution against the emperor, fragmentation of China by armed warlords, establishment of the Kuomintang, at first with support from communist Russia, union of Kuomintang and the Chinese Communists, the invasion by the Japanese, split between Kuomintang and the Communists, and finally civil war between Kuomintang and Communists. Rather than try to untangle this history, the following discussion will be devoted to the factors that led to the Communist victory. It is common to say that the nationalist government was corrupt. It undoubtedly was. Most governments are. But more important, it was weak. It was incapable to enforcing its own laws or implementing its own policies throughout China. To the average Chinese, the government was them, not us. The communists did an excellent job of convincing the average Chinese that the communists were part of us. There was a lot more coercion of the populace and elimination of capitalists than apologists for the communists are willing to admit. However, the communists did gain favor with the people by killing landlords, corrupt government officials, and money lenders. They also recruited warlords to their cause, or failing, that killed them and took over their armies. All of this not only eliminated some obstacles to their progress, but gained the support of the people who had been victimized by the communist targets. Mao Zedong was a brilliant leader, both military and political. He recognized that political leadership was at least as important as military leadership. He recognized the need for 5 components of his revolutionary movement. 1. Mass support. 2. Party organization. 3. Military organization. 4. Favorable terrain. 5. Economic strength. Mass support was critical. Without that, Mao's revolution would have failed. Hence his famous statement that the guerrillas are the fish and the people are the sea in which they swim. Military organization is an obvious necessity. Less obvious, but at least as important, is party organization. This is what allows the guerrillas to replace the government in areas where the government is weak or has been driven out by military force. People need a framework in which laws are enforced, criminals punished, and disputes adjudicated. In China, it was the lack of this framework that gave the communists their greatest opportunity. They provided this framework, even if their law enforcement was driven by Marxist ideology. Favorable terrain becomes a bit tricky. What is favorable depends on the nature of the war. For Lawrence of Arabia, the desert was favorable terrain. For the Viet Cong, jungle was favorable terrain. For Hamas, cities are favorable terrain. Hence, the would-be resistance leader must determine of the terrain available to him which is favorable and which is not. There can be no general answer. The experience of the Norwegian resistance against the Nazi invasion suggests that mountains are not necessarily favorable terrain. It was comparatively easy for the Nazis to cut off the resistance fighters access to food and other supplies. Likewise, prior to World War II, the French and Spanish were able to isolate the Rif guerrillas in the mountains of North Africa, bringing their revolt to a halt. In any case, Mao was able to make effective use of the terrain available to him. Other resistance leaders must do the same. The Japanese invasion turned out to be a benefit to the communists in two ways. First, the communists largely avoided fighting the Japanese. The nationalists bore the brunt of the anti-Japanese battle, while the communists husbanded their strength for the post-war battle. Second, the Soviets invaded Manchuria at the end of World War II, accepted the surrender of the Japanese armies there, and turned over the captured Japanese weapons to the communists. The Soviets continued to supply weapons to the communist forces following the end of World War II. Thus, the presence of a border with a friendly country was an important asset to the communists. Even with supplies from the Soviets, the communists in China would have had a much harder time without their political and military organizations. These were critical to their victory. Other resistance leaders should learn from this experience. Armed groups are little better than bandits unless they have the support of the people. That support can be gained only through a good political organization. The Cuban Revolution under Fidel Castro. The Cuban Revolution took place against a government that was both corrupt and inept. Fulgencio Batista had overthrown an elected president in 1952. The result was that most Cubans denied Batista's legitimacy as ruler. Although Cuba was the fourth most prosperous country in Latin America at the time of Castro's revolution, it still had large numbers of poor peasants. Moreover, it had a middle class that was dissatisfied with Batista and his corruption. On July 26, 1953, Cuban rebels attacked the Moncada barracks. The attack was a disaster, with nearly half the attackers being killed and the rest captured. Castro was imprisoned. He was released after 2 years as part of a general amnesty. He then went to Mexico, where he formed the July 26 movement among Cuban exiles. In 1956, Castro and 81 followers invaded Cuba by sea. The result was again a disaster, with most of the invaders being captured. Castro and a handful of followers reached the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they carried out a guerrilla war against the Batista government. Castro received considerable help from the people in the area, who were upset by the Batista government's curtailment of civil liberties. However, Castro's group was not the only resistance group. Other rebel groups were formed in other parts of Cuba. In a departure from Maoist doctrine, the Cuban Revolution was largely a middle-class revolution rather than a peasant revolution. In the cities, strikes, riots, and urban terrorism prevented the Cuban army from concentrating on Castro's forces. Most of the recruits to Castro's forces came from the cities, not from the countryside. Castro's efforts gained little support outside Cuba until Herbert Matthews, a reporter for the New York Times, made his way to Castro's headquarters and wrote glowing reports characterizing Castro as a romantic hero who was fighting for a democratic Cuba. The U.S. press then took up the cause of the revolution, pointing out how bad Batista was, but not saying a word about Castro's communist connections. In the face of support for Castro in the U.S. press, the U.S. government stopped supporting Batista with arms and training. The Cuban armed forces themselves began to mutiny against Batista, and moderate forces in Cuban society, seeing no other alternative, joined forces with Castro. The end result was Castro's triumphant entry into Havana on January 8, 1959. After a failed attempt by others to form a government, Castro assumed complete control of Cuba. One major disadvantage faced by Castro's rebels was the fact that Cuba is an island. Supplies could be brought in only by ship, and then they had to be transported inland to the rebel bases. In fact, most of Castro's weapons and other supplies had to be diverted from legal sources within Cuba rather than be brought in directly. A major advantage of the Cuban rebels was the Batista government itself. Not only was it a dictatorship, but it was an incompetent one. Its denial of civil liberties turned the Cuban population against it, especially the middle class, because of its corruption and incompetence. It was unable to deal effectively with the revolution. Even the armed forces were unreliable. One important key to the success of the revolution, however, was the lack of support for the Batista government from other governments, especially the U.S. government. The Batista government was isolated and unable to mount a successful counterattack to Castro or any of the other revolutionary groups that opposed it. Good grief. This stuff is such a dry read, I swear. Alright. The Viet Minh. The Vietnamese revolution against the French was like the communist victory in China. A complex affair. A look at some of the factors behind the Viet Minh's success as compared with the Viet Cong's later failure is instructive. Under the Yalta agreements at the end of World War II, with the surrender of Japan, Vietnam was to be occupied in the south by British forces and in the north by Chinese forces until French forces could reestablish the pre-war colonial government. The Chinese had no love for the French, so they were quite happy to allow the Viet Minh to form a government in the north. Later French attempts to oust the Viet Minh foundered on their failures to alleviate problems in the north. In particular, the Japanese had plundered the area of rice for several years. The Vietnamese were literally starving. The French made no attempt to deal with the food shortage. They occupied the cities, but left the Viet Minh in control of the countryside. The Vietnamese had no reason to support the French. Ho Chi Minh put together a coalition of anti-French and nationalist groups, arguing that they could achieve independence. The Viet Minh also began what was essentially a terror campaign against the French and any Vietnamese who supported the French. Ultimately, rather than surrender to French demands, in December of 1946, the Viet Minh forces attacked French garrisons and the war was on. The Viet Minh were led politically by Ho Chi Minh and militarily by Vo Nguyen Giap, while Ho organized the government in the areas under Viet Minh control. Giap succeeded in gaining control of the territories adjacent to China. With the success of the communists in China in 1949, this meant that the Viet Minh had a border with a friendly country. They were able to obtain weapons and other support, including material transshipped from Russia through China. Politically, the French were faced with an impossible situation. Vietnamese leaders, both communists and nationalists, wanted independence. This the French were unwilling to grant. They feared that if the Vietnamese received independence, the French possessions in North Africa would also demand independence. Various halfway measures, such as making Vietnam an independent state within the French Union, were unacceptable to the Vietnamese. Ultimately, for better or worse, the French were unable to gain the support of enough Vietnamese to overcome the Viet Minh. The end result was a partition of Vietnam, with the north under communist rule and the south under a puppet emperor and later under a dictator. Israel. This ought to be interesting. Most often, the picture of Israel is a state that demonstrated its military effectiveness after obtaining independence. However, it gained that independence through armed resistance. There had been a Jewish presence in Palestine even after the destruction of the Judean state by the Romans about the year 70. However, that presence increased significantly after 1870, when Theodore Herzl organized a Zionist movement to bring Jews back to Palestine. Total numbers were about 40,000 by 1900 and 85,000 by 1917. The important point here is that the Jewish return was not an invasion in the usual sense. Individual Jews bought land from individual Arabs and settled on it. Unfortunately, in some cases, the immigrating Jews bought land from absentee Turkish and Arab landowners, displacing Arabs who had been tenants on that land for generations. Jews. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which promised the Zionists a homeland in Palestine. This was done largely to gain support for Britain among Jews worldwide. Following World War I, Britain was given a League of Nations mandate to govern Palestine. Large numbers of Jews migrated to Palestine, in part driven by anti-Semitism in Europe. Britain needed access to Middle Eastern oil and tried to maintain peace between Arabs and Jews. If anything, British policy favored the Arabs rather than the Jews. The Jewish population in Palestine grew to 500,000 by 1935. In 1936, the Arabs started an armed rebellion which wasn't stamped out by the British until 1938. Although there had been Jewish militias in Palestine since 1905, the British attempted to discourage the Jews from organizing defensive units. However, with the Arab rebellion, the Jews saw the need to develop more effective armed groups. In 1941, the British allowed Haganah Defense Organization to organize guerrilla groups to operate in Syria, a French mandate from the League of Nations, Some 30,000 Palestinian Jews fought in British Army units, gaining military experience. Although the Jewish Brigade Group was officially disbanded at the end of World War II, an underground Haganah group continued to exist. It consisted of not only guerrilla units, but a ready reserve and territorial militias, all professionally commanded as well as covert supporters. In addition to Haganah, an essentially conventional military and guerrilla force, there were several Jewish terrorist organizations, particularly Irgun and the Stern Gang. These latter attacked not only British officials but also moderate Jews. Jewish resistance involved smuggling Jews from refugee camps in Europe into Palestine and smuggling weapons into Palestine. Both smuggling efforts were difficult since the territory had no friendly border and the British controlled the eastern end of the Mediterranean. The refugee ship Exodus 1947, carrying 4,500 Jews, was caught and forced to return to Hamburg, where the refugees were simply dumped on the dock. However, considerable numbers of Jewish refugees and weapons were successfully smuggled into Palestine. Britain, exhausted by World War II, no longer had the will to maintain peace between Jews and Arabs. No. You don't say the freaking British. Come on now. After hanging a few terrorists and suffering some retaliatory hangings in return, the British announced they would give up their mandate effective May 15th, 1948. This left the United Nations partition plan dividing Palestine between Jews and Arabs as the internationally accepted outcome. As history was to show, this was only a temporary result, but it did mean that a Jewish state would come into existence. 3 things needed to be noted here. First, Jewish armed resistance against Arab attacks was important to the ultimate establishment of the State of Israel. Second, terrorism by Irgun and the Stern Gang had an unfavorable impact on public opinion in nations important to Israel. Third, the military training received by large numbers of Jews during World War II served as the basis for Haganah and the later Jewish army. Algeria. Alright, now we're on Algeria. The French invaded Algeria in 1830. As noted above, they were successful in isolating rift guerrillas in mountainous terrain and neutralizing them. Algeria effectively became part of metropolitan France. However, it was run in a feudal manner by French colonists and a small Muslim elite. The nationalistic feelings of the Algerians came to a head on VE Day, May 8th, 1945, with Muslim riots in North African cities that led to the death of over 100 French colonists. French militias retaliated, killing some 20,000 Algerians. Algerians who had served in the French army in World War II, and later some who had been imprisoned by the Viet Minh and indoctrinated with anti-French nationalism, formed a guerrilla army. The organization Secret. The initial operations of the OS were unsuccessful, with the leader Ben Bella being captured and imprisoned. Oh my gosh. Despite French attempts at reform in Algeria, it was too little and too late. In 1954, the OS, after spending several years in covert training and fundraising, attacked 30 French military posts and distributed propaganda leaflets demanding independence, while promising to respect European rights and maintain close contact with France. Oh gosh, it's so hard to read when I have all this anxiety and ADHD. The French response was repressive, which drove even moderate Algerians into the arms of the armed resistance. To complicate things further, France granted independence to Morocco and Tunisia. This gave Algeria 2 borders with friendly countries. The Front de Liberation Nationale was able to use those borders to bring in weapons and to escape from French forces. Despite building a fence along the border with Tunisia, the French were unable to stop infiltration, announcing a right of pursuit into Tunisia further alienated the Tunisian government. The FLN prematurely went to battalion-sized operations against the French. They were not yet ready to fight a regular army in the field and suffered heavy casualties. Furthermore, the French made effective use of long-range patrols and helicopters to defeat the FLN forces. Defeated in the countryside, the FLN switched to terrorism in the cities. Ultimately, however, the success of the Algerian Revolution came through the fall of the government in Paris, bringing General de Gaulle to power. He decided to cut his losses and agreed to negotiate independence for Algeria. Again, the Algerian War for Independence illustrates the importance of borders with countries sympathetic to the resistance and the importance of giving the populace a goal they can support and sympathize with. Independence was such a goal. Alright, on to East Timor. The eastern half of the island of Timor was colonized by the Portuguese. The western half by the Dutch. As part of the Dutch East Indies, the island was occupied by the Japanese during World War II. An anti-Japanese guerrilla movement was fostered by Australian commandos. Following the Japanese defeat, the nation of Indonesia declared independence, including the western part of Timor, as a province. Following a 1974 coup in Portugal, the Portuguese government freed all its former colonies. The Revolutionary Front for Independent East Timor won a short civil war and declared East Timor's independence in 1975. Indonesian military forces invaded East Timor shortly after the declaration of East Timor's independence. Lacking an army, the people of East Timor were not able to put up formal military resistance. However, they put up a successful guerrilla war for over 3 years. However, in January 1979, the Indonesian forces surrounded and wiped out the last guerrilla force still operating against them. In 1980, a new guerrilla force was organized using primarily captured Indonesian weapons. Neither Portugal nor the United Nations recognized Indonesia's claim to East Timor. The East Timorese never accepted rule by Indonesia. However, their guerrilla effort was unable to dislodge the Indonesians. The population suffered enormously from torture, massacres, and starvation. The Indonesian occupation is estimated to have cost the lives of 100,000 East Timorese, out of a population of approximately 1 million. International pressure finally forced the Indonesian government to accept a referendum in East Timor in 1999. The East Timorese overwhelmingly voted for independence. A transition administration from the UN lasted for 2 years, followed by establishment of a local government. The primary lesson from the resistance in East Timor is the importance to the resistance of simply surviving and keeping up the fight. Allowing the resistance forces to be surrounded and wiped out leaves the civilian population undefended. Another lesson is the importance of having the full support of the population. For over 20 years, the civilians in East Timor suffered tremendously but never wavered in their desire for independence. Yet another lesson is that even without significant external support, a resistance movement can survive and continue to fight using captured weapons and equipment. Unsuccessful resistance movements. Most resistance movements are not successful. A few examples follow to illustrate some of the reasons for a lack of success. Greek Civil War. The Germans had occupied Greece during World War II. They evacuated Greece in late 1944. Communist guerrillas had already begun action against the Germans during the war. With the arrival of British forces in October 1944, the Communist forces began their attempt to take over Greece. They quickly established themselves in areas vacated by the Germans but not yet controlled by the British. Moreover, the incoming British forces were too small to effectively control the country. Despite agreements to disarm, the Communist forces were able to use Yugoslavia and Albania, both under Communist control, as sanctuaries. By 1946, the Communist forces were conducting raids on villages in Greece and taking hostages to assure the cooperation of the local people. By 1947, the Communist forces controlled large portions of Greece. Unfortunately for the insurgents, they alienated the population instead of gaining its support. The guerrillas kidnapped nearly 30,000 Greek children and sent them to be raised in neighboring countries under communist control. They also committed random acts of terror and murdered numerous government officials. All of this cost them the support of the Greek people. On the government side, the Greek army greatly improved its capabilities. At first, it attempted sweeps and clearing operations. Eventually, it shifted to protection of the population against guerrilla attacks. Once the guerrilla forces were cut off from the population, they were deprived of intelligence about the Greek army and were eventually defeated. Another factor in their defeat was the Yugoslav government's closing of the border, depriving the guerrillas of their sanctuaries. A lesson from this insurgency is the importance of not antagonizing the population on which the insurgents depend for support. Another is the importance of a friendly border. Yet another is the foolhardiness of lightly armed guerrilla forces attempting to defeat a regular army in conventional battle. Now we're on to the Philippine insurgency. During World War II, the Japanese occupied the Philippines. Several resistance groups operated against the Japanese throughout the occupation. One of these was the Hukbalahap, or People's War to fight the Japanese. With the surrender of Japan and re-establishment of American control over the Philippines, the Huks initially attempted to gain control by political means. However, the Philippine government denied seats in the legislature even to legally elected Huks. The result was a return to guerrilla war by the Huks. They announced a land to the landless campaign to gain support from the people. The initial government response by President Roxas was a conventional military one. Sweeps, massive attacks, heavy use of artillery, and much thrashing with little effect. This resulted in antagonism between the army and the Philippine population. The Huks were ready to take advantage of this antagonism. They obtained food and intelligence from the local population. However, the Huks overplayed their hand. Some of their members were criminals who used the insurgency for their own profit. Individual Huk commanders were jealous of their own authority and were reluctant to cooperate with each other. The Huks assassinated the popular widow of former President Quezon. All these things made the people wary of them. In addition, the Huks controlled an area in central Luzon. They had no friendly border. They had little access to a seacoast. They were restricted to the supplies they could obtain from the local population and the weapons they could capture from the army. They simply did not have the logistical capability to mount a major campaign. The turning point came with the appointment of Ramon Magsaysay as Minister of Defense. He believed that the role of government was to protect the population. He took measures to improve discipline in the army and to bring the army to look on the population as its allies rather than its enemies. He also offered an amnesty program to defectors from the Huks. He also encouraged the army to use small unit tactics to surprise and ambush the guerrilla forces, rather than engage in sweeps. These measures brought the Huk insurgency under control within 18 months. However, Magsaysay was unable to convince the rest of the government to adopt the political reforms needed to undercut any future insurgency. He resigned from his post and ran for president. He was elected in 1953. He died in a plane crash in 1957, and attempts at reform died with him. The insurgency resumed after his death. The Huk insurgency emphasizes the importance of gaining the cooperation of the local population. Intimidating them into cooperation works only until the government provides effective protection for them. Also, selecting the area of operations should take into account logistics as well as the ability to hide. Alright. Okay. Malayan insurgency. During World War II, the Japanese occupied the British colony of Malaya. The British government fostered the growth of guerrilla units to fight the Japanese. With the surrender of Japan in 1945, the British returned to Malaya. However, it soon became apparent that the pre-war status could not be re-established. Communist guerrillas, primarily ethnic Chinese, fought against restoration of British rule. In addition to guerrilla units, they developed a network of civilian supporters, the Min Yuan, to provide supplies and intelligence about British activities. Initially, the communists were very successful in intimidating the non-Chinese population and establishing liberated areas. The ultimate downfall of the communists came from the British recognition that first they had to promise independence to the people of Malaya, and second they had to protect the population against the guerrillas. The British built new villages and moved large numbers of the rural population into them. The displaced population actually lived better than they had in their old villages. In addition, no one was moved into a new village until a police post was established and manned to provide the villagers with protection against communist sympathizers in their midst. The result was twofold: denial of intelligence to the guerrillas and increased intelligence available to the British. Another important feature of the British response was devolution of operational responsibility down to platoons and squads. Instead of large unit sweeps and use of artillery and aircraft, these small units were given the initiative to pursue guerrillas based on locally obtained intelligence. The final result was the collapse of the communist insurgency. By 1955, the government could cease offensive operations, and by 1960, the war was over. From the standpoint of the insurgents, one of their big problems was that the insurgency was based on an ethnic minority, the Chinese. They never succeeded in gaining the willing support of the Malay population. Once they could no longer terrorize the majority, their effectiveness dropped dramatically. Another problem was the lack of a friendly border. The government of Thailand, the neighboring country, was not sympathetic with the communists. On the contrary, it was fighting its own battle against communists on the other side of the border. Perhaps the most fundamental reason for the failure of the Chinese insurgents in Malaya was that they were not trying to overthrow a tyrannical government. On the contrary, they were trying to establish one. The British offer of independence with majority Malayan rule was something the communist insurgents could not match. Okay, the Viet Cong and National Liberation Front. Following the defeat of the French, a 1954 Geneva Conference agreed to partition Vietnam at the 17th parallel pending elections to unify the country. Over 800,000 refugees moved from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. Although many Viet Minh fighters moved to the north, many cadres remained behind to serve as the focal point for later insurgency. Initially, prospects looked good for a renewed insurgency in South Vietnam. The Diem government was corrupt and inept. An attempt at land reform, providing land to the peasants, resulted in large tracts of land being claimed by Diem's relatives and supporters. Abandoned land had been claimed by the Viet Minh cadres and turned over to peasants, gaining their support. Attempts to move the rural population into fortified hamlets, agrovilles, failed. The peasants were very reluctant to abandon the graveyards of their ancestors, and the government never provided adequate funding for the moves. American advisors tried to mold the Vietnamese army into an American-style army, heavy on armor and artillery and road-bound. The task of dealing with insurgents at the local level was left to inadequately trained and poorly equipped civil guards. There were many nationalist groups in South Vietnam, all of which had their own reasons for opposing the Diem government. They soon allied themselves with the communists in the National Liberation Front. In September 1960, the North Vietnamese government officially recognized the existence of the NLF and called for liberation of the South and reunification of the country. The communists gradually gained control of the NLF and began following Mao's approach, consolidating the areas they already controlled, establishing base sanctuaries, and setting up a parallel government in areas still under control of the government of Vietnam. The successful Viet Minh organization was copied. Main force regiments, effectively regular troops and paramilitary forces that could defend their own villages against government forces and could be called upon to supplement main force actions. The NLF also carried out a very successful propaganda campaign to gain supporters of the peasants. This was done mainly through individuals and small groups that would visit a village, listen to the villagers' grievances, and offer the possibility of a better life if the existing government were overthrown and its foreign supporters evicted. In all of this, the Vietnamese army and the American forces that had started as advisors and later grew to combat forces failed to understand the nature of the war they were fighting, the war the NLF was winning. The NLF was giving the peasants something worth fighting for, and the counterinsurgents weren't offering anything in competition. The introduction of the American combat troops escalated the war but did not change its basic nature. Sweeps, attrition, and search and destroy missions failed to end NLF activity and did nothing to stop the infiltration of the North Vietnamese army. The sweeps might uncover NLF supply dumps but did nothing to protect the peasants against the NLF. The war dragged on, and the NLF had no trouble recruiting to replace its combat losses. What went wrong? Ultimately, the NLF overreached itself in the Tet Offensive of 1968. This consisted of attacks on major cities throughout South Vietnam. Contrary to the expectations of the NLF, there was no popular uprising in response to these attacks. Despite the NLF's efforts at propagandizing, they still depended too much on intimidation to gain the support of the people. When the people could not be intimidated, that support was withdrawn. The Tet Offensive, instead of resulting in an uprising against the South Vietnamese government, resulted in the destruction of the NLF. For the rest of the war, the NLF was irrelevant. It was the North Vietnamese army that marched into Saigon in 1975, after defeating the South Vietnamese army in a series of conventional battles. The NLF played no role whatsoever in the subsequent unification of Vietnam. The Maoist program of starting with a guerrilla campaign in rural districts and growing to the point of developing a conventional army to conquer the cities worked in China against a weak and inept government. It also worked for the Viet Minh in North Vietnam, especially once the French government lost the will to continue the war. However, it did not work in South Vietnam. Despite the numerous mistakes made by the American army in Vietnam, the NLF could not defeat it in conventional battles. The primary lesson from the failure of the NLF and the Viet Cong is that outweighting a powerful army while bleeding it may be more effective than trying to defeat it in conventional battle. Okay, now on to John Brown. Brown's adventure is probably most instructive as a lesson in what not to do. It was botched from start to finish. Brown had participated in the fighting between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas in 1856 and was an accused murderer and fugitive. he came up with the idea of fomenting a slave uprising. His plan was to attract slaves to a wilderness area in the Appalachian Mountains and conduct guerrilla warfare. Knowing that the slaves would not be familiar with firearms, he intended to arm them with pikes. In 1859, Brown conducted a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. In doing so, he violated almost every rule of warfare imaginable. In seizing the arsenal, he placed the Potomac River between himself and his base of supplies on a farm in Maryland. He failed to leave a force on the Maryland side of the Potomac to secure his line of communications. By failing to secure the heights over the arsenal, he and his men were vulnerable to the federal sharpshooters who soon occupied those heights. Worst of all, he had no thought-out plan for what to do after he seized the arsenal. Even had slaves been willing to rebel, most never heard of his raid and would have had no means of traveling to join him if they had heard. In short, his tactics were poor and his strategy non-existent. John Brown provides an excellent example of just about everything not to do. And now we have "The state can be beaten." The following quotation is taken from the Mises Memo for summer 2002. In so many ways, why did they put parenthesis around that? In so many ways, the state is a fiction. It has no existence apart from the people's willingness to believe it and give it life with their money and obedience. It was 12 years ago that the immense and seemingly permanent apparatus of the Soviet world empire wasted away like Oz's wicked witch of the West. Why? Because the willingness to believe had been withdrawn. This is a key point. The object of any resistance movement is ultimately to cause people to quit believing in the existence of and giving support to the existing state. Hell yeah. The focus of any resistance movement must be on the minds of the people. Armed resistance is simply a means of getting people to change their minds. The people must start looking at the state as them and the resistance movement as us. History shows this can be done. When it is done, the task of the resistance movement is essentially finished, except for mopping up. And there you have it, chapter 2. And yes, the resistance movement, yes, absolutely, that is us. And if you want to learn more about that and how you can help us, what did they say? We need to quit giving support to the existing state. So, yes, go to www.theafr.org. That's American First Republic, AFR.org. But it's www.theafr.org. We have meetings Sunday nights, Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock. And on the website there's a link to the Telegram channel. You can come in there. You'll have to introduce yourself, and then we'll let you in. And you can ask questions, and we'll try to explain what we're doing. Essentially bringing the power back to the people of the Republic in every state. in a social compact with the Articles of Confederation. So, with that, I hope you all have a blessed week ahead, a blessed night. Bandit out.